The morning of May 8th, 1945. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann stood beside what remained of his Jagdtiger tank destroyer near the village of Siegburg, east of the Rhine. The massive 70-ton vehicle, Germany's most powerful armored weapon, sat silent, its ammunition exhausted, its fuel tanks empty. Around him, scattered across the rolling hills of the Ruhr Valley, lay the wreckage of what had once been the 512th Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion. Burned-out hulks of German armor dotted the landscape like tombstones. The Third Reich had 48 hours left to live. 3 American soldiers approached, their weapons lowered but ready. Hartmann raised his hand slowly. At 23 years old, he had commanded tanks since 1943, fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts, and believed with absolute certainty in German technological and tactical superiority. That certainty was about to collide with a truth so overwhelming that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans loaded Hartmann and his surviving crew members onto a truck. As they drove west toward a prisoner of war processing center, Hartmann stared through the canvas covering at the countryside rolling past. What he saw made no sense. Endless columns of American vehicles moved in both directions, not just combat vehicles, but supply trucks, fuel tankers, ambulances, repair vehicles. He had spent 2 years fighting a war of scarcity, where every liter of fuel was precious, where replacement parts never arrived, where his battalion waited weeks for a single delivery of ammunition. The Americans moved equipment as if it were infinite. At the processing center near Remagen, Hartmann and 200 other German prisoners were assembled in a large field. An American intelligence officer addressed them in fluent German. He explained that they would be transported to the United States for the duration of their detention. The United States? Hartmann had been told by every propaganda minister, every commanding officer, every political officer that American cities lay in ruins, bombed by U-boats, crippled by economic chaos. Germany was fighting an enemy barely capable of keeping its own population fed. The officer continued, "You will work on farms and in factories. You will be paid for your labor. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Several prisoners laughed nervously. This had to be another trick. But 4 days later, when the Liberty ship pulled away from the dock at Le Havre, Hartmann began to understand that the Germany he had fought for had lied about more than just the condition of American cities. The ship was enormous, far larger than any vessel Hartmann had ever seen. Its hull carried not only 800 German prisoners, but also returned empty supply containers, damaged American vehicles being sent back for repair, and according to one of the guards, nearly 10,000 tons of scrap metal from the battlefields. An American sergeant told him, through an interpreter, that Liberty ships had been built at a rate of 3 per day at the height of the war. 3 ships this size, every single day. Hartmann did the mathematics in his head. He had been taught that Germany possessed the world's finest engineering and industrial capacity. The Ruhr Valley was supposed to be invincible. Yet the Americans were building cargo vessels faster than Germany had built tanks. Something fundamental in his understanding of the war was beginning to crack. The voyage across the Atlantic took 11 days. During that time, Hartmann spoke with other prisoners, men from every branch of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. A U-boat commander named Dietrich told him about the endless American destroyer escorts he had encountered in the Atlantic. "We would sink one," Dietrich said quietly, "and 2 more would appear the next day. Always 2 more. Where did they come from? How many ships can one nation build?" A Luftwaffe pilot named Werner described the American fighter aircraft he had faced over Germany. "I shot down 4 of their Thunderbolts in 6 months," he said, "but for every one I destroyed, 10 more appeared. 10 more, with fresh pilots, well-trained pilots. How do you fight that?" Hartman listened and said nothing. He had commanded Tiger tanks on the Eastern Front, where he had learned to fear the Soviet T-34 not because it was superior to German armor, it was not, but because there were so many of them. The Soviets accepted horrific losses and simply built more tanks. He had assumed the Americans would be different, more sophisticated, more concerned with the lives of their soldiers. But as he listened to these men describe the American war machine, a terrible understanding began to form. The United States was not trying to win through sophistication. They were winning through something far more devastating: abundance. The ship arrived at Norfolk, Virginia on May 23, 1945. As the prisoners were marched off the vessel, Hartman saw the harbor. He stopped walking, causing the man behind him to bump into his back. The guard shouted at him to keep moving, but Hartman could not stop staring. The harbor stretched as far as he could see. Dozens of ships, cargo vessels, naval warships, oil tankers moved in organized chaos. Massive cranes lifted containers with mechanical precision. Warehouses the size of city blocks lined the waterfront. And beyond the immediate port, Hartman could see factories. Smokestacks rose against the evening sky, their outputs suggesting full production even though the war in Europe had ended weeks ago. This was not a nation on the brink of collapse. This was not a country struggling to feed its population. This was not an economy crippled by war. This was something Hartman had never imagined possible. A nation that had grown stronger during the war, not weaker. They were loaded onto trains, clean, well-maintained trains with padded seats, and transported south. Hartman found himself assigned to a prisoner of war camp in southern Virginia, a facility that housed nearly 3,000 German soldiers. The camp was not what he expected. There were guard towers, yes, and barbed wire, but the buildings were sturdy, the food was adequate, and after 2 weeks the prisoners were organized into work details. Hartman was assigned to a local farm that grew tobacco and corn. Each morning, a truck would arrive and transport him and 15 other prisoners to the fields, where they worked alongside the farmer's family and several local laborers. The work was hard, but no harder than military service, and at the end of each day they received meals that included meat, fresh bread, and vegetables. It was during these first weeks in rural Virginia that Hartman began to grasp the full scale of what he had fought against. The farmer who owned the land, a man named William Crawford, spoke enough broken German to communicate basic instructions. One evening, as Hartman and several other prisoners were loading harvested tobacco onto a truck, Crawford asked them about the war. Hartman, exhausted and no longer caring about military discipline, told him about the Jagdtiger, the most powerful tank destroyer Germany had built, mounting an enormous 128mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 3 kilometers. Crawford listened politely, then asked how many Jagdtigers Germany had built. Hartman told him the truth, approximately 80, maybe 90. Crawford nodded slowly. Then he mentioned, almost casually, that his brother worked at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal near Detroit. He said the factory had built more than 18,000 Sherman tanks during the war. 18,000, from a single factory. Hartman felt his stomach drop. He had been told Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks total. The most powerful German heavy tank, the Tiger, had been built in numbers around 1,300, and the Americans, from one factory, had produced 18,000 of their main battle tank. One factory. He asked Crawford, trying to keep his voice steady, how many tank factories America operated. Crawford did not know the exact number, but guessed there were at least a dozen major facilities, probably more. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Hartman spent the night doing calculations on a piece of scrap paper. If one American factory produced 18,000 tanks, and there were 12 such facilities, the numbers became absurd. They suggested American tank production exceeded 200,000 Sherman vehicles. That could not be correct. It had to be propaganda in reverse, Americans bragging to demoralize their prisoners. But as the weeks passed, Hartman saw more evidence. The trucks that transported prisoners were standardized. The same model, the same design, produced in vast quantities. The uniforms worn by American soldiers were identical, mass-produced. Even the food containers were standardized, labeled with factory codes that suggested production lines measured in millions of units. One afternoon, a new group of prisoners arrived at the camp, men captured during the final weeks of the war. Among them was a Panzer officer named Ludwig Becker, who had served in the 3rd Panzer Division. Hartman recognized him immediately. They had both attended the same armored warfare training course in 1943. That evening they sat together in the camp's recreation area, a large wooden building where prisoners could smoke, play cards, and read newspapers that the American Red Cross provided. Hartman asked Becker about his experiences in the final battles. Becker's face darkened. "We ran out of everything," he said quietly. "Fuel first, then ammunition, then food. But it was the tanks themselves that finished us. My battalion started the year with 42 Panthers. By April, we had 7 operational. The rest broke down. Transmissions mostly. We had no spare parts, no way to repair them, so we abandoned them." Hartman knew this story. It was the story of every German armored unit in the final year of the war. German tanks were magnificent machines when they worked, but they broke down constantly, and the supply system had collapsed. He had spent months in the Ruhr pocket watching his own Jagdtigers sit immobile, waiting for parts that never arrived. "But here is what I cannot understand," Becker continued, leaning forward. "I captured an American Sherman in March near Cologne. The crew had abandoned it after taking a hit to the turret. The tank was still functional, the engine ran, the tracks moved. My crew and I decided to use it rather than our own Panther, which had a broken transmission." "And, Hartman asked. "It was extraordinary," Becker said. "Simple, reliable. The engine started every time. The controls were easy to operate. The Americans had designed it for mass production and for crews with minimal training. Everything was standardized. Any part from one Sherman could fit into any other Sherman. And when I opened the maintenance manual, it was designed for common soldiers to understand. Pictures, simple language. The Americans had built a tank that a farm boy could repair." Hartman absorbed this information slowly. German tanks were engineered by craftsmen. Each Tiger was nearly handmade, precision-built, requiring skilled mechanics to maintain. The complexity made them superior in combat, when they worked, but it also made them impossible to produce quickly or repair easily. The Americans had made a different choice. They had built a simpler tank, produced it in staggering numbers, and designed it so that any mechanic in the field could fix it. They had chosen quantity and reliability over individual superiority, and they had won. Over the following months, Hartman's work detail expanded beyond the Crawford farm. In July of 1945, he and several other prisoners were assigned to help with the harvest at multiple farms throughout the county. The American government paid the farmers 45 cents per hour for each prisoner's labor, and the prisoners themselves received 80 cents per day. Money they could spend at the camp canteen on cigarettes, writing materials, and small luxuries. But it was not the work or the wages that transformed Hartman's understanding. It was the abundance. At the Crawford farm, Hartman observed the family's daily life. They ate 3 meals a day, every day, with meat at least once daily. Their farmhouse had electric lighting, running water, and a refrigerator, a luxury Hartman had only seen in the homes of senior Nazi officials in Berlin. The family owned 2 automobiles, both manufactured before the war but still functional, maintained with readily available spare parts. One evening, Crawford's teenage son asked Hartman about life in Germany.
Hartman tried to explain how German families had lived on rations since 1939, how butter and meat had become rare luxuries, how clothing was patched and repatched until it fell apart. The boy listened with genuine confusion. He could not comprehend a world where such basic necessities were scarce. This confusion, Hartman realized, was itself revealing. Americans had fought a global war on two fronts, sent millions of men overseas, and built the largest military machine in human history, and their civilian population had experienced inconvenience, not deprivation. They had rationed certain goods, yes, but no one had starved. No cities had been reduced to rubble. The war had been something that happened elsewhere, while American factories ran at full capacity and American farms produced more food than the nation could consume. In August, Hartman was transferred to a different work detail. Along with 20 other prisoners, he was assigned to a canning factory in the nearby town, a facility that processed vegetables and fruits for civilian consumption and military rations. The factory operated with minimal supervision. Most of the male workers had been drafted, so the workforce consisted primarily of women, older men, and now German prisoners. On his first day at the factory, Hartman watched the production line with professional interest. He had worked in German armaments factories during training exercises and had toured several manufacturing facilities as part of his officer education. He understood industrial production. But what he saw at this small-town American canning factory exceeded anything he had witnessed in Germany. The factory
processed 40,000 cans per day. 40,000. It operated with mechanical precision, each worker performing a specialized task in perfect synchronization with the machinery. The conveyor belts moved at a constant speed. Quality control inspectors checked random samples. Damaged cans were immediately recycled, and at the end of each shift, trucks arrived to transport the finished products to distribution centers. The factory manager, a man named Robert Harris who spoke no German, communicated through hand gestures and a prisoner who had worked as a translator. Harris explained that this facility was one of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of similar operations across the United States. Each one processes tens of thousands of units daily, all of it coordinated through a logistics network that functioned with remarkable efficiency. Hartman asked the translator to inquire about production during the war. Harris pulled out records showing that between 1942 and 1945, this single factory had produced more than 50 million cans of food. Most had gone to military rations. Some had been sent to Britain under Lend-Lease. The rest had been sold to American civilians. 50 million cans from one small-town factory in 3 years. Hartman thought about the food situation in Germany during the final year of the war. Soldiers at the front had received reduced rations. Civilians in the cities had lived on bread and potatoes, sometimes not even that. The German supply system had collapsed not because of Allied bombing alone, but because Germany had never possessed the industrial infrastructure to sustain a long war. The nation had gambled on quick victories and had lost that gamble by 1942. But America had not gambled. America had built a system designed to produce supplies indefinitely, in quantities that seemed impossible to German minds trained in concepts of scarcity and careful resource management. During his lunch break at the factory, Hartman sat with other prisoners in a designated area. One of them, a former Luftwaffe mechanic named Ernst, had been reading American newspapers that the Red Cross provided. Ernst showed Hartman an article from a Detroit newspaper, dated August 19, 1945. The article described the conversion of war factories back to civilian production. The Willow Run bomber plant, which had produced B-24 Liberator bombers during the war, was being retooled to manufacture automobiles. The article mentioned, almost casually, that Willow Run had produced more than 8,000 bombers during the war years. 8,000 four-engine heavy bombers from a single factory. Ernst pointed to another section of the article. It says here that the Ford Motor Company is planning to produce 500,000 automobiles next year. 500,000 in 1 year for civilians. Hartman stared at the newspaper. Germany's total automobile production in
1944 had been approximately 90,000 vehicles, and most of those had been military trucks. The Americans were planning to produce 5 times that number for civilian use alone, and the war had been over for only 3 months. "We never had a chance," Ernst said quietly. "Did we?" Hartman did not answer immediately. He had spent his entire adult life in military service, trained in the belief that German discipline, German technology, and German tactical excellence would overcome any numerical disadvantage. His instructors had taught him that 1 German soldier was worth 3 enemy soldiers. 1 German tank was worth 5 enemy tanks. Quality over quantity, excellence over mass production. But excellence meant nothing if the enemy could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. Quality meant nothing if your superior tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel while the enemy's simpler tanks kept moving. Discipline meant nothing when your army starved because the supply system had collapsed. "No," Hartman finally said. "We never had a chance." That evening, back at the camp, Hartman attended a lecture organized by the American Re-Education Program. The lectures were officially voluntary, but most prisoners attended out of boredom and curiosity. Tonight's speaker was a professor from the University of Virginia who had been invited to discuss American economic history. The professor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, spoke in careful German. He explained that the United States had entered World War I as a debtor nation and emerged as the world's primary creditor. The war had transformed American industry, teaching manufacturers how to produce at unprecedented scales. After the war, those same techniques had been applied to civilian production: automobiles, radios, household appliances. Then came the Great Depression. American industrial capacity had been gutted. Unemployment reached 25%. Factories closed. But the infrastructure remained: the trained workers, the engineering knowledge, the transportation networks. When World War II began, the professor explained, President Franklin Roosevelt had made a crucial decision. Rather than building new industries from scratch, America would convert existing civilian industries to military production. Automobile factories would build tanks and aircraft. Shipyards would construct naval vessels at assembly line speeds. The entire civilian economy would be mobilized for war, but in a way that preserved civilian production of essential goods. The professor showed statistics on a large chart. American aircraft production, 1941, less than 20,000 planes. American aircraft production, 1944, 96,000 planes. American tank production, 1941, 4,000 tanks. American tank production, 1944, 17,000 tanks. American shipbuilding, 1941, 1 million tons. American shipbuilding, 1943, 19 million tons. Hartman copied these numbers onto a piece of paper. He wanted to verify them, to find the error, to prove that this was Allied propaganda designed to demoralize German prisoners. But as the lecture continued, the professor cited sources: official production records, congressional reports, manufacturing surveys. These were not estimates. These were documented facts. The professor then compared American production to German production. He displayed this comparison matter-of-factly without gloating. German aircraft production, entire war, approximately 113,000. American aircraft production, entire war, approximately 300,000. German tank and assault gun production, entire war, approximately 67,000. American tank production, entire war, approximately 88,000. Soviet tank production, entire war, approximately 106,000. combined Allied tank production, nearly 200,000 vehicles. The German prisoners sat in stunned silence. Even accounting for Soviet losses, which had been catastrophic, the mathematics were devastating. Germany had fought a war against an industrial coalition that outproduced it by a factor of 3 to 1, perhaps 4 to 1. And those numbers did not include British production, Canadian production, or the industrial output of smaller Allied nations. After the lecture, Hartmann approached the professor. Through the translator, he asked if these statistics were accurate. The professor looked at him with something like sympathy. "These are conservative estimates," he said. "The actual numbers may be higher. Your government knew this by 1943 at the latest. Your intelligence services provided regular reports on Allied production capacity, but your leadership chose to ignore the data." Hartmann felt something cold settle in his chest. German intelligence had known. The High Command had known. They had understood that the war was mathematically unwinnable, that no amount of tactical brilliance or technological superiority could overcome such a disparity in industrial output. And they had continued fighting anyway, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives in a war that was already lost. Back in his barracks that night, Hartmann could not sleep. He lay on his bunk and thought about the conversations he had overheard during his time as a tank commander, officers complaining about supply shortages, mechanics unable to repair vehicles for lack of parts, infantry units receiving ammunition deliveries measured in hundreds of rounds when thousands were needed. He thought about the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final major offensive in the West, launched in December of 1944. The operation had been predicated on capturing American fuel supplies because German forces did not have enough fuel to reach their objectives. The entire strategy had assumed that American logistics would collapse, that German tanks could simply steal what they needed from captured depots. But American logistics had not collapsed. Even when temporarily disrupted, the system had recovered within days. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, everything had arrived in quantities that German planners could not comprehend. The offensive had failed not because of American tactical superiority, but because German forces had run out of everything, while American forces had plenty of everything. The next day, Sunday, prisoners were allowed to move freely within the camp compound. Hartmann found Becker, the Panzer officer who had captured the Sherman, sitting in the recreation hall. Several other armored vehicle officers had gathered around him, discussing their experiences. A Tiger commander named Friedrich was speaking. "I destroyed 11 enemy tanks on the Eastern Front," he said, "mostly T-34s. I learned to respect the T-34. It was well designed, well armed, but the Soviets sent them forward in waves. We would destroy 5, and 10 more would appear. We could not kill them fast enough." "The same in the West," Becker added. "I fought near Bastogne during the Ardennes offensive. We encountered a company of American Shermans. We destroyed 6 of them. Then we ran out of ammunition. The Americans called for reinforcements, and 12 more Shermans arrived within 2 hours. 12 more. Where did they come from? How far could their supply lines extend?" Hartmann listened as these men, all experienced tank commanders, all decorated soldiers, described the same phenomenon. German forces had won tactical victories repeatedly. They had destroyed more enemy vehicles than they lost. They had demonstrated superior training and superior equipment. And none of it had mattered because the Allies could replace losses overnight, while German losses were irreplaceable. "I spoke with an American tank sergeant last week," Hartmann said. "He told me that if his Sherman was damaged beyond field repair, his unit would simply abandon it. Recovery crews would tow it back to a depot, and within 24 hours, his crew would receive a replacement tank. Sometimes the replacement was brand new. Sometimes it was a repaired vehicle, but there was always a replacement." "That is how they won," Friedrich said bitterly. "Not through courage or skill, through mathematics." But Hartmann was beginning to understand that this analysis was incomplete.
American victory was not simply a matter of numbers. It was a matter of system design. The Americans had built an entire civilization around the principle of abundance. Their economy, their culture, their military doctrine, everything was predicated on the assumption that resources were effectively unlimited, that any problem could be solved by throwing more equipment, more supplies, more industrial capacity at it. Germany had built its civilization around the opposite principle, scarcity. German culture valued precision, efficiency, excellence in small quantities. German engineering produced magnificent machines built by craftsmen. German military doctrine emphasized decisive maneuver warfare designed to achieve victory before logistics became critical. Both systems worked within their respective contexts, but when forced into direct competition, abundance defeated excellence. Mass production defeated craftsmanship. Industrial capacity defeated tactical brilliance. In September of 1945, Hartmann received permission to send a letter home. Mail service to Germany had been restored for prisoner correspondence, though all letters were censored by American authorities. He wrote to his father, a retired Wehrmacht colonel who had served in the First World War. Hartmann wrote carefully, knowing the censors would read every word. He described his treatment as a prisoner, fair, respectful, adequate food and shelter. He described the American countryside, vast, productive, untouched by bombing. And then he wrote something that he knew the censors would allow because it served their purpose. Father, I have seen the factories. I have seen the farms. I have worked alongside American civilians and spoken with American soldiers. Everything we were told about this nation was false. They were not weak. They were not decadent. They were not on the brink of collapse. They were stronger than any of us imagined, and they became stronger during the war, not weaker. We lost not because our soldiers lacked courage or because our equipment was inferior. We lost because we challenged an industrial power beyond our capacity to comprehend. The numbers are staggering, Father. One American factory produced more tanks than our entire nation built during the entire war. One factory. I have verified this through multiple sources. It is not propaganda. It is a fact. I do not know what Germany's future holds, but I know this. We must never again make the mistake of underestimating America's industrial capacity. That mistake cost us everything. Hartmann sent the letter and never received a response. He would learn later that his father had died in Soviet captivity in January of 1946, one of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who did not survive their detention in the East. The Soviets had treated their prisoners far differently than the Americans. This too was part of the system. American abundance extended even to the treatment of enemy prisoners. They could afford to feed and house captured soldiers according to international law because they had enough food for everyone. The Soviets, operating under conditions of scarcity created by German invasion, could not afford such considerations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.